Creating extraordinary success in business and life is absolutely possible. That means more income, more freedom, and more energy for what you value most without the hustle or burnout. I'm Laura Flood, certified success and high performance coach, CEO for over 30 years, and a multiple seven-figure entrepreneur. I've built a profitable, sustainable business while prioritizing my family, my health, and my happiness, and I'm here to help you do the same. This is the Redefining Success podcast, where I'll share the strategies, tools, and the mindset shifts to help you grow with intention, live a life you love, and create lasting happiness, wealth, and freedom without losing yourself in the process. Let's dive in. Hey there, welcome back to the Redefining Success podcast. I've been thinking a lot lately about how success changes people emotionally. Not in the obvious ways that people usually talk about. I mean the quieter shifts that happen over time once someone becomes established, respected, and responsible for maintaining the life that they've built. Because in the beginning of building something, there's usually a different relationship with risk. You move faster, and you try things before you're ready and before you fully know what you're doing. You tend to make decisions with less overthinking because there isn't as much to protect yet. You're figuring things out as you go, and even though that season can feel stressful financially and emotionally, there's also kind of a freedom inside it. You're willing to experiment. And I can look back now at all the different seasons of my career and see how true this was for me too. When I was first building in real estate, I didn't have years of proof yet. I didn't have a reputation to maintain. And I wasn't carrying anywhere near the level of responsibility that I eventually would. I was just trying to create momentum and opportunity anywhere that I could. And honestly, I think that willingness to move before feeling fully ready, it helped me tremendously. Over time, something starts to shift a lot for high achievers. Your business begins working, and you become known for what you do. People expect things from you, and you really start to expect big things from yourself too. Your standards and responsibilities increase, and the stakes start to feel higher. Without even realizing it, though, many successful people slowly become more careful. I've seen this happen with entrepreneurs, coaches, realtors, and so many different business owners at almost every level. From the outside, their business looks successful. But internally, they've started avoiding anything that could disrupt the identity that they've already built. That's a very different kind of fear than what exists in the beginning. Early on, people are usually afraid that they won't succeed. But later, they become afraid of losing momentum, stability, and credibility. They're afraid of making the wrong move after they've already created something valuable. And that pressure, it really changes how people operate. I've experienced this myself at different points in my career. There were seasons where I could feel myself becoming slower to move on ideas that normally would have excited me. I would spend more time evaluating decisions and revisiting things, trying to make sure everything made sense before moving forward. From the outside, it probably looked responsible. But what I eventually realized was that part of me had become emotionally attached to maintaining what had already worked. And I think this happens far more than people realize, especially with high achievers who have the income that supports their family, their lifestyle, and the life that they've worked incredibly hard to create. At some point, success stops feeling connected only to possibility, and it starts feeling connected to pressure too. That's where people begin operating more from protection than possibility. And the tricky part is that it can still look productive while it's happening. You're still working, producing results, and managing everything well, but at the same time, your world slowly becomes smaller because you stop putting yourself in situations where failure feels possible. I think that this is one of the hidden reasons people start to feel disconnected from their business after so many years of success. A lot of times they stopped allowing themselves to grow in the same way that they once did. They stopped experimenting and became less willing to place themselves in the situations where they might be seen learning something new. And eventually, life starts feeling repetitive, even while their life still looks so impressive from the outside. And that's really what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the emotional relationship high achievers develop with failure once they've already had success and feel responsible for maintaining that. Because I think understanding that changes everything, not only in business, but in the way success actually feels day to day. One of the things that I've noticed over the years is that successful people often become very skilled at staying inside what they already know how to do well. And I understand why. When you've spent years building credibility, creating income, learning your industry, and becoming excellent at something, your brain naturally wants to protect that. You've already proven that you can produce results there. You know how to operate there and you trust yourself. The reality is, growth eventually asks you to step beyond what already feels comfortable and proven. Our next level starts requiring something emotionally different from us. And usually, it asks for uncertainty again. A lot of people pull away from that moment without fully realizing that they're doing it. I remember a season in my business where everything was stable and successful. The systems were working, business was producing consistently. I had experience, reputation, and momentum. But internally, I could feel myself hesitating around certain decisions that normally would have energized me earlier in my career. There were ideas that I kept revisiting instead of acting on, and things that I wanted to build that I just stayed in planning mode around for way too long. And I wasn't avoiding work. I was still very productive every day. If anything, I probably looked even more disciplined from the outside. But what I eventually realized was that I had unconsciously started prioritizing emotional safety over expansion. That was a really hard thing to admit to myself because I've always seen myself as someone willing to take action. But high achievers can become incredibly sophisticated at disguising avoidance as responsibility. Sometimes it sounds like, I just need a little more clarity, or I want to make sure that this is the right decision. And sometimes it turns into endless refinement, over preparing, or revisiting things repeatedly before moving forward. But underneath it all, it's usually the same fear. The fear is, what if this doesn't work after everything I've already built? And that fear lands differently once you've already created success, especially when other people are depending on you. When you're younger or earlier in business, there's often less emotional attachment to outcomes because your identity hasn't fully aligned with your performance yet. But later, success can start feeling so personal and we become more cautious emotionally. I worked with a client recently who had built a really successful business over several years. She was smart, respected, and incredibly capable. From the outside, almost nobody would have guessed that she felt stuck. But during one of our coaching conversations, she said, I feel like I keep repeating versions of the same year. And that sentence carried so much weight because what she was really describing wasn't a lack of success, it was this lack of emotional expansion. She had become extremely efficient at maintaining what had already worked. But at the same time, she stopped putting herself in situations where she might feel inexperienced, uncertain, or uncomfortable. And once we started unpacking it more deeply, she realized that she just slowly trained herself to avoid anything that could threaten her sense of competency. And honestly, I think a lot of successful people stay there longer than they realize. They stay inside what's proven, validated, and familiar. Then eventually they wonder why they feel restless and disconnected, even after creating the level of success that they worked so hard for. So, one thing I've learned is that humans need growth emotionally. That's a different energy that exists when you're stretching into something new, when you're creating, learning, and evolving. And I think part of what makes entrepreneurship so fulfilling for so many people is that it demands growth constantly. You're becoming someone new in real time. The problem is that once people become highly competent, they often stop allowing themselves to be beginners again. Beginners feel vulnerable and don't always know the answer immediately. They have to tolerate uncertainty publicly sometimes. And that discomfort can feel really unsettling to someone who's spent years building an identity around being capable. I've had to work through this so many times personally in multiple seasons of business, especially whenever I've entered a new level where I no longer had all those years of evidence to reassure myself. There's a very different emotional experience between repeating something you already know how to do and stepping into something where the outcome is still unknown. One feels familiar and predictable, and the other one asks you to trust yourself in places where you don't already have proof yet. And I think that's where a lot of the deeper work begins for high achievers, learning how to keep moving towards growth without needing every outcome to feel emotionally certain first. Because the need for guarantees is often what keeps people repeating the same version of life and business over and over again. A lot of the next chapter gets created in the moments where you move before you fully know how everything is going to unfold. I think one of the reasons this conversation matters so much is because avoiding failure doesn't feel obvious when it's happening. Most people don't wake up and consciously decide that they're going to stop growing. Avoidance starts disguising itself as productivity. People stay busy. They still work hard and produce results, but at the same time, they slowly stop placing themselves in situations that stretch themselves. And this is where perfectionism starts becoming really important to pay attention to. Perfectionism is often less about excellence and more about emotional protection. I see this all of the time with high achievers. They spend weeks refining something that could have been released already. They overthink decisions that don't actually require that much analysis. They stay in research mode for months, or they keep tweaking instead of moving forward. They revisit ideas repeatedly, trying to remove uncertainty before taking action. I remember talking with a client who felt constantly mentally exhausted. At first, she thought the issue was her workload. But as we unpacked it further, that wasn't actually what was draining her. What was draining her was the amount of mental energy she spent trying to avoid mistakes. Every email, every launch, and piece of content, it carried so much emotional weight for her. She had become so identified with maintaining her level of success that she stopped allowing herself room to experiment. And what's interesting is that perfectionism often increases as people become more successful. Visibility and responsibilities increase, and failure starts feeling less like that didn't work and more like, what does this say about me? And when every outcome becomes personal, your growth starts to slow down. One thing I've noticed in my own life is that some of my biggest breakthroughs happened after periods where I felt really uncomfortable. I could feel myself outgrowing the current version of how I was operating. And honestly, that kind of discomfort, it can be confusing. A lot of entrepreneurs tell themselves they're unclear, but most of the time, they already know where they're being pulled. They know what they want to build or pursue. The deeper issue is usually whether they can emotionally tolerate the uncertainty required to get there. And that's a much more honest question. One exercise that I've started giving clients has been incredibly revealing, and it's just asking them to identify where they've become overly attached to feeling capable. So, Where do you only feel comfortable when you know you'll perform well? And where have you stopped allowing yourself to learn publicly? Where are you trying to eliminate uncertainty before taking action? Those questions uncover so much because the areas that we feel the strongest need for control in are often the exact places where growth is trying to happen next. And this is important too. I'm not talking about reckless decisions, just staying available for expansion. Expansion often requires us to release the need to feel emotionally protected all the time, and that discomfort can be challenging. But still, I think those moments are often pointing people towards the next version of themselves. I want to talk about why failure feels different when your identity is attached to success, because this is the part of the conversation that changes everything for people once they really see it. Failure itself usually isn't what stops high achievers. It's the meaning that they attach to that failure. And the more successful someone becomes, the more emotionally loaded those meanings can become if they're not careful. Because after a while, success stops feeling like something you created. It starts feeling like something you have to maintain. And that creates pressure internally. There's so much pressure to keep producing and proving yourself at the level people now expect from you. And I think this is one of the hidden emotional realities behind high performance that almost nobody talks about, honestly. People see successful entrepreneurs and assume confidence removes the fear. But what usually changes is your willingness to move while fear is present. There have been moments in my business where I questioned myself before making a move that eventually became incredibly important. When you care deeply about your work and when you've spent years creating a reputation, visibility changes emotionally. Decisions feel bigger and you become aware of the consequences. And what I see a lot is you realize people are watching. Over time, it becomes very easy to start attaching your identity to how every decision turns out. But living that way becomes emotionally exhausting. I remember a time where I kept circling a decision for far too long. I knew the direction that I wanted to move. I could feel it clearly. But still, I kept revisiting it, running scenarios in my mind, analyzing different outcomes. I was trying to create certainty before acting. And then one day, I just finally asked myself, what exactly am I trying to avoid here? And the answer surprised me. I was afraid of what I would make the outcome mean about me if it didn't unfold perfectly. Once I saw that, I understood the real issue had nothing to do with strategy, it had everything to do with identity. I see so many high achievers unknowingly build emotional security around being capable, reliable, and respected. So when something doesn't work, it can trigger much deeper emotions than the actual event itself deserves. When a launch underperforms and suddenly someone feels embarrassed, or a decision doesn't land perfectly and suddenly they question themselves entirely, or maybe a new idea takes time to gain traction and they begin doubting their ability. None of those situations are actually identity emergencies, but they can feel that way emotionally when your self-worth has become tied to all the outcomes. I coached someone through this recently after building an offer she was excited about and it didn't perform the way she expected. And honestly, she wasn't really upset about the numbers nearly as much as she was upset about what she thought the results said about her. She kept replaying the situation, trying to understand what she had done wrong. And as we worked through it together, I asked her, what if this result is simply information instead of identity? And you could almost feel the relief in the room because those are two completely different experiences emotionally. Information allows adjustment. And when we look at identity, that can create shame. And shame makes people retreat. That's why some entrepreneurs stop taking bold action after disappointments. They made the experience way too personal. One of the healthiest shifts that I've made over the years is learning how to separate outcomes from my self worth so much faster. So that doesn't mean that I never feel disappointment. Of course I do. There are still moments that sting, and there's definitely moments where things don't unfold how I hoped. And times, of course, where I wish something had gone differently. But the difference now is that I recover emotionally faster because I no longer interpret every challenge as evidence about who I am. I think resilience is often misunderstood. People think that resilient people don't feel disappointment deeply. But in my experience, resilient people usually feel things fully, but they process it, they learn from it, they adjust, and they just continue moving forward. That creates a completely different relationship with failure than most people ever develop. This is one of the most important emotional skills that entrepreneurs can build. It's the ability to remain available for growth without requiring constant emotional validation along the way. Because growth rarely feels validating while you're inside of it. Sometimes it feels uncertain, it feels messy and uncomfortable. And other times it really stretches your confidence. And understanding that helps people stop panicking every time they enter a new level. Sometimes your identity is expanding faster than your nervous system fully feels prepared for yet. And that's a very normal part of growth, especially for people who are building something incredible. When I look at people who continue evolving over long periods of time, one thing almost always stands out. They are willing to enter rooms, conversations, opportunities, and seasons where they don't fully know how things are going to unfold yet. There's almost this openness to growth that stays intact. And I believe that that matters so much, especially after someone has already built success. Because once you become highly capable in one area of life, your brain naturally wants to keep operating where it already feels competent. You know how to win there, how to recover. You know how to navigate those environments emotionally. So stepping into a new level can feel very different. There's this uncertainty again. There's almost always a new learning curve and a new version of yourself that you haven't fully met yet. I've experienced this so many times in business. Every major expansion season of my life required me to tolerate periods where I felt stretched so much emotionally. But building at a higher level, it always asks something different from me internally. It asks for more trust and more flexibility. And honestly, there were moments where I could feel my brain wanting to retreat back towards where I was comfortable. I think so many people experience this and mistake it for a sign that they should stop. What I've learned is that growth often feels unfamiliar long before it feels safe. I think understanding that changes the way people interpret growth entirely. So, one thing that I've started paying close attention to in my own life is where I feel emotionally alive again. There's a different energy that exists when you're learning and stretching and becoming someone new. Many entrepreneurs miss that feeling once they settle fully into their maintenance mode. Their business keeps functioning and routines become predictable. And eventually, there's a quiet awareness that something internally has stopped moving. I had a conversation recently with a client who reached a level of success that she once only dreamed about. She had financial stability and she was respected and she loved her business. But she kept feeling this sense of restlessness. At first, she assumed that she needed another strategy or another goal. But as we talked more, what surfaced was something entirely different. She was missing the version of herself who used to believe bigger things were possible. And that really hit me hard when she said that, because I think so many successful people They slowly stop allowing themselves to imagine beyond their current level once their life becomes more established. Their goals become safer, they become more reasonable and more emotionally manageable. And while there's wisdom in maturity, there's also something powerful about staying connected to possibility. I think that possibility changes people. It changes how they think and how they move and show up in their life. And one of the healthiest things that high achievers can do is regularly place themselves back into environments where growth is required again. This could look like learning a new skill or pursuing a bigger vision. It could be increasing your visibility or putting yourselves in bigger rooms, creating a new offer, or saying yes to opportunities that stretch your identity. Because growth needs movement, and movement creates new evidence. One thing that I've noticed over the years is that confidence usually expands after you take action. Some of the most confident seasons of my life came after periods where I felt really uncertain, but I kept moving anyway. There's something incredibly powerful about realizing that you can survive unfamiliar territory. And people begin relating to themselves differently after that. You begin trusting yourself differently, and you stop needing that emotional guarantee before making decisions. You recover faster after disappointments, and you stop interpreting every uncomfortable moment as a sign that something has gone wrong. I think that's where real self trust starts developing. And I believe that this is one of the biggest differences between people who continue evolving throughout life and the people who slowly plateau emotionally. Some people stay available for growth even after they've become successful, and there's humility in that. There's this courage in continuing to expand after you already know how to succeed, especially when the current version of life works really well. One thing that I'd really encourage you to pay attention to after this episode is where your life or business has started feeling more repetitive than expansive. Where have you been maintaining instead of growing? Where have you become more focused on protecting what already works than creating what's next? What have you been overthinking, delaying, or emotionally circling that you already know that you want to move forward with? And where you have slowly stopped allowing yourself to imagine beyond the version of success that you already know how to sustain. Those questions can reveal so much because sometimes the next chapter of your life begins with the willingness to feel inexperienced again for a little while. There's something really special about that season of life. You start to feel excited again. You're more engaged and more connected to possibility. There's a different kind of energy that comes back when you stop needing every decision to feel completely certain before you move. Life really starts to feel expansive again. You stop just maintaining the version of success you've already built, and you really start allowing yourself to grow into what's next. One of the biggest personal shifts that I've had over the years is realizing how much energy people spend trying to avoid emotional discomfort, especially high achievers. When you've built a life where people rely on you, there's often this underlying pressure to keep everything moving smoothly all of the time. You want to make good decisions and protect what you've created. And after a while, it becomes easy to organize your life around avoiding that emotional disruption. I don't think I fully understood how much I was doing that until different seasons of business forced me into growth again. There were moments where things changed quickly. Markets shifted, industries evolved, consumer behavior changed and business models were changing. And suddenly the strategies that once felt easy required a completely different level of thinking and adaptability. I've talked before about building my career through multiple market shifts in real estate, including 2008. And what those seasons taught me more than anything was how quickly certainty can disappear. People who had been successful for years suddenly found themselves needing to rethink everything. And honestly, those seasons changed the way I think about business and life in a lot of ways. They taught me how important it is to stay adaptable mentally instead of becoming too attached to things feeling predictable all the time. There's a confidence that develops when you stop expecting life and business to always feel stable. You really start to understand that your ability to adapt matters far more than your ability to control every outcome. And that really creates a different relationship with fear. I remember one season where I had to make several decisions quickly inside my business, and I did not have complete certainty around how everything would unfold. Part of me really wanted more guarantees before moving forward. I wanted more reassurance, more evidence or confirmation of what I was thinking. But at the same time, I knew that waiting too long would keep me stuck exactly where I was. And I see so many people live inside that tension for years. They keep waiting to feel fully ready emotionally before they move towards what they already know they want. And eventually, that hesitation becomes exhausting. And avoiding discomfort, it rarely creates freedom long term. Usually, it just creates more mental pressure, more overthinking or second guessing, more emotional attachment to outcomes. I started feeling a lot more freedom in my business and life once I stopped needing everything to feel completely certain before I trusted myself to move forward. It means that I stopped treating uncertainty like an emergency. That distinction changed a lot for me personally. I see many entrepreneurs unknowingly spend years trying to eliminate risk from growth. And growth has never worked that way for me. Every season of expansion that I've experienced, it involved periods where I had to move before I had complete evidence. I had to trust my ability to respond, to adapt, and to recalibrate as things unfolded. I had a client recently who was preparing to make a major shift in his business. He had spent months thinking about it. He was researching, planning, and analyzing everything. And during one of our sessions, I finally asked him, what would happen if you trusted yourself to figure things out as you go instead of trying to emotionally solve the entire future beforehand? I think many high achievers mistake endless preparation for control. What they're usually looking for is relief from uncertainty, but uncertainty is part of every level of growth. Every new level asks us to trust ourselves differently. And that's one of the reasons why entrepreneurship becomes such personal development work over time. Your business constantly reveals where your self trust ends. That awareness can feel uncomfortable initially, but eventually it becomes so liberating because you stop expecting yourself to control every variable emotionally. Eventually, you realize that you don't need to become fearless to expand your life. You just need to become more willing to stay present while your uncertainty exists. Because fear and discomfort, they can still be there, and you can continue to move forward anyway. When your trust in yourself becomes stronger than your need to control every outcome, that's where the real freedom begins. One of the hardest parts of growth for high achievers is realizing that the next level of life usually requires a different internal experience. Not just more achievement, but a different relationship with success itself. And honestly, many people reach a point where they quietly realize their current way of operating is no longer sustainable emotionally, even if it still works externally. That's an important distinction. A strategy can still produce results while simultaneously draining your quality of life. And I think people feel this long before they admit it. They start to notice it in small moments. They're feeling mentally pulled back into work constantly and struggling to fully disconnect. They find themselves replaying decisions after the day is over and feeling emotionally on all of the time. But eventually, there's a moment when they realize, I don't want success to feel like this anymore. And once someone sees it, they usually can't unsee it. I had a conversation with a client who said something recently that captured this perfectly. She told me, I've built a business that works, and somehow I still feel like I'm carrying it everywhere with me. And I know that so many entrepreneurs understand that feeling immediately. When your body is technically away from work, but part of your mind never fully leaves it. You're always thinking about what needs attention, what could go wrong, or what you need to follow up on. And over time, carrying that level of mental responsibility, it starts creating a kind of exhaustion that slowing down for a weekend doesn't really fix. One of the biggest shifts that I've made personally is learning how to stop emotionally gripping everything so tightly. Learning that took a lot of practice over the years, especially as someone who cares so much about excellence and results. But eventually I realized that carrying all that constant internal pressure was not making me more effective. It was making everything in business and life feel heavier than it needed to. And this is where failure can actually become an important teacher. Failure forces people to realize that they can survive outcomes that they once feared emotionally. They survived the embarrassment, disappointment, and uncertainty. They stopped needing perfection and treating every decision like it determines their worth. They stop making every uncomfortable moment mean that they're off track. And that creates so much more emotional space, and it changes the entire experience of success. You think more clearly, you recover faster, and you become more creative again. You stop operating from that survival energy all of the time. I've noticed in my own life that some of my best ideas, decisions, and my strongest seasons happened after I stopped trying to emotionally control every outcome. There's a different kind of confidence that develops when you trust yourself to handle what happens instead of trying to predict every possibility in advance. There's less urgency attached to every decision and less internal gripping around outcomes. That's a huge part of what redefining success has become for me, both personally and professionally. Creating success from a place of clarity, trust, and structure, and emotional capacity instead of that constant internal pressure. And that shift changes everything. After decades in business, one of the things that I've become more aware of is how easy it is for successful people to slowly stop giving themselves permission to expand. Their life gets full and their responsibilities increase. People begin relying on them, so they just develop routines that work. And after a while, it becomes really easy to stay inside what already feels proven. That's why this conversation around failure matters so much. Failure forces movement, and it interrupts repetition, and it reveals where fear is still shaping decisions quietly in the background. And while those moments can feel uncomfortable, they also create incredible opportunities for growth if we're willing to stay open inside them. Some of the most important seasons of my life came after moments where things didn't unfold the way I originally expected. At the time, those experiences felt disappointing, uncertain, or emotionally uncomfortable. But looking back now, many of them became turning points for me. They pushed me to think differently. They pushed me to lead differently and trust myself so much more. So many people are standing right at the edge of that kind of expansion right now. They can feel that their current way of operating no longer fits who they're becoming. They feel the tension between what's familiar and what's next. Part of them wants more, but part of them still wants that emotional safety. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this episode, it's this. Your next level probably won't feel comfortable immediately. And discomfort doesn't automatically mean that something is wrong. Sometimes it means that your life is asking you to trust yourself more deeply than you have before. Or it might mean that your identity is expanding faster than your certainty. Sometimes it means you're finally stepping outside of the version of success that no longer fully fits you anymore. I believe one of the greatest gifts that we can give ourselves is the willingness to remain open to become someone new, to keep learning and stretching and evolving, even after we've already created success. Because I truly believe that life feels very different when you stop organizing everything around avoiding emotional discomforts. Eventually, you realize the moments that you feared most, they often become the experiences that expanded your life the most. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this episode resonated with you, be sure to share it with someone who's been feeling emotionally drained, overly careful, or who's disconnected from the growth or excitement they know they still want in their life. And if you're ready to create success with more space, clarity, capacity, and a business that supports the life that you actually want to live, the links for the Redefining Success coaching and other ways to work together are in the show notes. Looking forward to seeing you in the next episode.